Continuing on, democracy and civil rights. Preserving institutions and rule of law. President Biden and Vice President Harris took decisive action to restore and strengthen American democracy. Upon taking office, he immediately restored the independence of the Department of Justice to respect the rule of law. He also signed the Electoral Count Reform and Presidential Transition Improvement Act into law, establishing clear guidelines for certifying electoral votes to preserve the will of the people and protect against the type of attempts to overturn our elections that led to the January 6th insurrection. Countering hate and protecting religious freedom. The Biden-Harris administration took numerous steps to counter hate in all its forms and promote pluralism. Attorney General Merrick Garland appointed the Justice Department's first ever anti-hate crimes resources coordinator and designated staff to oversee expedited review of hate crimes. The FBI elevated hate crimes and criminal civil rights violations to its highest level national threat priority, which increased the resources for hate crimes prevention and investigations and made hate crimes a focus for all 56 of the Bureau's field offices. President Biden hosted the first ever White House United We Stand Summit to address the hate-fueled violence that threatens our public safety and democracy. At the summit, the White House established the White House Initiative to counter hate-motivated violence and announced an historic package of new actions to foster national unity and counter hate and toxic polarization. President Biden established an interagency group to increase and better coordinate federal efforts to counter anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and related forms of bias and discrimination within the United States. The President released the first ever U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism and the first ever U.S. national strategy to counter Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate. The Biden-Harris administration sent a guide to the leadership of more than 5,000 colleges and universities with information on resources to promote campus safety, and the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights issued new guidance through a Dear Colleague letter to every school district and college in the country, providing examples of anti-Semitic discrimination as well as other forms of hate that could lead to investigations for violations of Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, further expanded security capacity building services to synagogues, community centers, and Jewish day schools. These services included risk assessments, planning assistance, tabletop exercise packages, and active shooter and bomb prevention-related training. Since January 2023, CISA personnel have conducted nearly 400 visits with Jewish houses of worship and other institutions. The Office of the Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism at the Department of State promoted throughout the international community the U.S.-led Global Guidelines for Countering Anti-Semitism, a set of international best practices for effective public policy against anti-Semitism. More than 40 countries and entities have endorsed the guidelines. On his first day in office, Biden rescinded the discriminatory travel ban that prevented individuals from Muslim-majority and African countries from entering the United States. At President Biden's direction, the Department of State conducted a review of visa applications and took various corrective actions to process applications that were impacted by the discriminatory travel ban, including reconsidering previously denied applications. In 2022, President Biden became the first United States president to recognize Arab American Heritage Month, which is observed in April. In 2023 and 2024, President Biden issued proclamations honoring this month. On March 15, 2024, President Biden became the first president to mark the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. In observance of this day, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights sent a letter to every school district and college in the country, reminding them of their legal obligation to address discrimination against Muslim, Arab, Sikh, South Asian, Hindu, and Palestinian students. 14 federal agencies clarified for the first time in writing that Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act's protections prohibit discrimination on the basis of shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics, including certain forms of anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and related forms of discrimination and bias in federally funded programs and activities. In 2021, President Biden signed into law the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which includes the Khalid Jabara and Heather Heyer No Hate Act, to improve the reporting and prevention of hate crimes and ensure that hate crimes information is more accessible to Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. Since 2021, the Department of Justice awarded over $100 million in grants to law enforcement and prosecution agencies, community-based organizations, and civil rights groups to address hate crimes through outreach, investigations, prosecutions, community awareness and preparedness, reporting, hotlines, and victim services. Through the fiscal year 2024 National Security Supplemental, President Biden secured an additional $400 million for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which funded security improvements and training to nonprofits, including faith-based organizations such as houses of worship. President Biden reestablished the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, an agency centers for faith-based and neighborhood partnerships to collaborate with religious and community organizations on serving people in need. Through this bipartisan initiative, the administration worked closely with these organizations on objectives such as encouraging communities to get vaccinated for COVID-19, helping expectant mothers improve their health, connecting young people to jobs, internships, and apprenticeships, and affirming the key roles religious leaders play around the world in locally held development and humanitarian assistance. Throughout his term, President Biden continued to call on Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and Freedom to Vote Act to protect the sacred right to vote in free and fair elections and ensure the government is working for the people. In addition, President Biden took the following steps. In response to obstruction and refusal to even debate the bills, he called for reforming the filibuster to protect our democracy. As he fought for legislation, President Biden used the tools at his disposal to strengthen democracy, including issuing an executive order to promote voting access. Annual funding for federal civil rights offices increased by 23% during Biden's time in office. Since then, the Department of Justice more than doubled its number of voting rights attorneys and enforcement staff. President Biden marshaled the full resources of the federal government to protect American elections from foreign interference and to support state and local officials in their administration of free, fair, and secure elections. The Attorney General established a task force to protect election officials from an unprecedented rise in violent threats. Criminal justice reform and clemency. President Biden and Vice President Harris believed that effective, accountable policing is critical to making our communities safer. In 2022, President Biden issued an executive order on effective and accountable policing and criminal justice practices that requires federal law enforcement agencies to ban chokeholds, restrict no-knock warrants, mandate the use of body-worn cameras, provide de-escalation training, submit officer misconduct records into a new national database, and restrict the transfer of military equipment to local law enforcement agencies. President Biden continued to call on Congress to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act to advance accountability, transparency, and public trust in law enforcement. President Biden and Vice President Harris also believed it was time to end the country's failed approach to marijuana. To help remedy the country's failed approach to marijuana, including racial disparities, the administration launched the process to reclassify marijuana under federal law. President Biden issued categorical pardons for federal offenses of simple possession of marijuana, lifting barriers to housing, employment, educational opportunities, and more for thousands of Americans. President Biden used his clemency power to grant more pardons and commutations in 4 years than any of his recent predecessors. As mentioned, President Biden issued categorical pardons for federal offenses of simple possession of marijuana, lifting barriers for thousands. President Biden commuted the death sentences of 37 of the 40 individuals on death row to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Those individuals will have their sentences reclassified from execution to life without the possibility of parole. In December, the president carried out the largest single-day grant of clemency in modern history, commuting sentences of close to 1,500 individuals who were placed on home confinement during the COVID pandemic and who successfully reintegrated into their families and communities, and pardoning 39 individuals who were convicted of nonviolent crimes. Throughout his term, President Biden corrected sentencing disparities and promoted public safety by issuing historic pardons and commutations for individuals with unduly long sentences convicted of nonviolent offenses who had demonstrated a commitment to rehabilitation. President Biden redressed an historic injustice by categorically pardoning former LGBTQ+ service members that were convicted of private conduct because of their sexual orientation. And finally, we have Supreme Court reform. In the face of this crisis of confidence in America's democratic institutions, President Biden released a bold plan to reform the Supreme Court. No immunity for crimes a former president committed in office. President Biden called for a constitutional amendment that makes clear no president is above the law or immune from the prosecution for crimes committed while in office. This was his plan. This "no one is above the law" amendment would state that the Constitution does not confer any immunity from federal criminal indictment, trial, conviction, or sentencing by virtue of previously serving as president. So this actually is what Kamala Harris would have done, but wasn't able to move forward, not until she's president soon enough. Term limits for Supreme Court justices. President Biden endorsed a system in which the president would appoint a justice every 2 years to spend 18 years in active service on the Supreme Court. Term limits would help ensure that the court's membership changes with some regularity, make timing for court nominations more predictable and less arbitrary, and reduce the chance that any single presidency imposes undue influence for generations to come. Binding code of conduct for the Supreme Court. President Biden called on Congress to pass binding, enforceable conduct and ethics rules that require justices to disclose gifts, refrain from public political activity, and recuse themselves from cases in which they or their spouses have financial or other conflicts of interest. This many hours long reading of the achievements of the Biden-Harris administration is my response to mainstream media never telling us what Joe Biden was doing. Anything. Any of his achievements. Hardly ever. And now in the United States of America, here on May 20th, 2025, we have an absolute dangerous menace in the White House, and we have to all direct our thinking to sanity in our government. And miracles happen, and there's nothing that we cannot do. Joe Biden has always said, and I'm sure he's still saying it now, this is the United States of America. There's nothing that we cannot do. Thank you for tuning into these videos, whether you listen to all of them. They're a little mixed up, or because it was just a lot to do. I didn't want to make them all like one big long one. So we're in this together. The most important thing for me to have taken on this project is that we need to know what Biden accomplished, because it was hidden from us. All right. I'll see you real soon. Namaste.